No room for analogue now. Gary Numan and members of OMD look at how electronic music grew throughout the 70s. It's Trailblazers on Sky Arts.
The punk ethic was important because there was this element of just get up and do it. You know, we used to joke with people, well, you know, they'd play one chord and we'd use one finger. Every provincial city had its own punk club. We had Eric's. At Eric's, everybody in the audience was in a band. That's why, for a year or two, the most interesting bands from the whole of the British Isles didn't come from London. This was the whole thing about when we signed to Factory Records. Tony Wilson said, what you do is going to be the future of pop music. And we were like, we're experimental.
In 1975, just 3 years earlier, electronic music was not on most people's radar. The only songs that most of us expected to hear coming out of the continent were from Eurovision.
I remember a cringeworthy moment on my 13th birthday. Somebody actually bought me an ABBA single, and he was like, this is shit, you know, why on earth have you bought me an ABBA single? And then from nowhere, Kraftwerk had appeared, and it was, wow, something has changed here, something has really changed.
We'd heard Kraftwerk on the radio, we'd heard Autobahn on the radio in sort of 1975, and it really was sort of the first day of the rest of our lives.
Bands of all time.
I, fortunately, went to see them. They played at the Liverpool Empire on September the 11th, 1975, and I was sat in seat Q36. It made an impression, I remember it. And it was like watching the future. These four guys came on in suits and ties, short hair, two of them playing what looked like tea trays with wired up knitting needles. And it was just, this is the future. This is something I want to do.
You know, we kind of wanted to be Kraftwerk when we were, you know, because we were quite young. But there was no way we could be because all synths at that time were so prohibitively expensive that they were so out of our league. So we had to sort of beg, borrow, steal and make, really, and did a lot of the latter, making crazy machines that made mad noises.
The back room at Paul's mum's house actually looked a bit like this, with old radios and things which he used to cannibalise and take the parts out of and rebuild the circuits just to make things that made weird noises. For a year we didn't actually have a keyboard that you could play notes on, he just made weird noises.
The first machine I made that actually was useful was a drum machine, wasn't it? It was a very Kraftwerkian machine with sort of like these sort of metal knitting needles where you could kind of break the circuits to play a sort of a kick drum, hi-hat and snare and cymbal.
Every time we put it away at the end of Saturday, we'd get it out of the attic and it was broken, and he'd fix the part but with a different type of resistor or something, so it would make a completely different set of sounds. So when we were 16, we wrote Electricity, which became our first single.
End of '75, we played some very interesting shows here, especially in Liverpool, and we had a reaction from a younger band there. They introduced themselves like OMD Orchestral Manoeuvres in the dark. They told us that we have shown them the future. They wanted to throw the guitars tomorrow and go and buy synthesizers, and they did. And they made their own Brit sound of that. The Brit synth is different to German synth music, of course. It is British pop music, really good pop music.
We made a conscious decision to wear the most boring clothes we could. And in fact, we got called, you know, the boring bank clerks, or Orkman at C&A was another one. The trouble is, you have a couple of hits, you sell out the Hammersmith Odeon, and the entire front row are impressionable 17-year-old boys in white shirts, thin black ties and sleeveless tank tops. It's not a fashion statement, don't copy us.
They dressed like bank clerks, they literally wore suits and ties. Unfortunately for my sins, I sort of slightly emulated that and also got into white shirts and ties. And there was a bit of a crossover because Gary Numan used to have a red skinny sort of tie thing that he used to have on. So I went through a very skinny tie period in my life worked great with the girls and the girls' parents as well.
Human League had been around for a bit, Orchestral Manoeuvres, been around a bit. So I only learnt about them afterwards. When it's time to do my first tour, I come across Orchestral Manoeuvres, so I called them and they were up for doing it.
We were convenient because he had a gigantic stage set,
Yeah.
and he wanted to put a curtain in front of it. So two guys with a tape recorder were ideal. We didn't take up too much space. But because we didn't have any money, he offered us the tour. He transported our equipment. He transported us on his tour bus. And he was really wonderful.
You know.
In the early days, there was no way round sounding quite rigid, because you were, you know, the drum machine just went and that's all it did for 5 minutes, and our bass lines just went do 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 do. That's all they did for 5 minutes. So it was quite mechanical, but just by the very nature of the way the music was made.
Electronic music.
You can make something on a computer that sounds like a song, but it really isn't. It's just a series of bits that you've welded together that are not, you know, really creatively written or invented in somebody's head or feelings. The 80s saw the electronic pop bands. They evolved then into house and techno and dubstep and, you know, all the different genres where electronics were becoming more and more part of the music. But the reality is that most music now, whether it's called, you know, pop or rock or reggae or soul or anything, it's all done electronically. It's all recorded on Pro Tools. It's all edited and moved around. You know, rock bands go into a studio and it's processed to death and then spat back out again, and they pretend it's all organic rock. That was an interesting, you know, criticism that we and others used to get in the early days, which was that, you know, oh, you know, the machines are writing the songs for you. And we used to be like, no. If there was a button that said hit single, we'd be hitting it all day long. And there isn't one.